The Harper family name was one woven with threads of gold, old money, and unblemished reputation. In the affluent circles of Massachusetts, Arthur and Eleanor Harper were the architects of high society, presiding over charity galas and corporate empires with a manicured iron grip. They painted a masterpiece of a family for the world to admire. But beneath the veneer of perfectly landscaped gardens and pearl-stringed smiles, the Harper estate was a gilded cage, and its most tragic prisoner was their own daughter, Evelyn. At 32 years old, Evelyn Harper possessed a quiet, understated beauty that was entirely eclipsed by the shadow of her family's commanding presence. She was a woman who moved through her own life like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs of the family mansion. To the outside world, and even to herself most days, Evelyn was the fragile Harper, the delicate flower who couldn't quite handle the harsh sunlight of reality. This was not a narrative she had written for herself. It was a script meticulously drafted, edited, and directed by her parents and her older sister, Margaret. Margaret was everything Evelyn was not. 3 years older, Margaret was a sharp, predatory woman who inherited her father's ruthlessness and her mother's icy vanity. She was the golden child, the perfect heir to the Harper legacy, save for one deeply guarded secret. Margaret was incapable of having children. It was a perceived flaw that gnawed at her perfection, manifesting as a bitter, festering resentment directed entirely at her younger sister. For as long as Evelyn could remember, the narrative of her life was one of instability. If she expressed anger, Eleanor would place a cool, diamond-adorned hand on her forehead and whisper, "Hush, darling, your nerves are acting up again." If she showed independence, Arthur would shake his head, a portrait of disappointed paternal concern, and Margaret, with a serpent's smile, would orchestrate situations to make Evelyn doubt her own memory. Keys would go missing. Conversations would be vehemently denied. Over the span of 32 years, the family had chipped away at her sanity with 1,000 tiny calculated strikes, until Evelyn truly believed her mind was a fragile, unreliable thing. The only sanctuary Evelyn had was her sewing room. It was a sun-drenched conservatory at the back of the estate that she had converted into a tailor's paradise. Evelyn possessed a rare, undeniable genius with fabric. While Margaret flaunted designer labels, Evelyn understood the architecture of clothing. She could read a person's insecurities by the way a shoulder seam rested, and she could armor them in silk and wool. Her hands, so often trembling when she sat at the grand dining table, were steady and lethal with a needle. In this room, surrounded by bolts of Italian cashmere, French lace, and the rhythmic hum of her vintage Singer sewing machine, she wasn't a broken woman. She was a creator. Her husband, David Vance, was her supposed anchor in this stormy sea of psychological torment. David was a handsome, charismatic investment banker who had married into the Harper family 5 years ago. To the public eye, he was a saint. He was the devoted husband who patiently cared for his troubled wife. When Evelyn had one of her episodes, panic attacks carefully engineered by her mother or sister, David was the one who held her, stroking her hair, feeding her the mild sedatives prescribed by a family friend who happened to be a psychiatrist. "I'm here, Evie," he would croon, his voice a warm blanket over her shivering spirit. "I've got you. You don't need to worry about a thing." Evelyn clung to David like a woman drowning. She loved him with a desperate, pathetic kind of gratitude. He was the buffer between her and her family's coldness. But a gilded cage is still a cage, no matter how sweetly the warden speaks. The looming shadow over the family dynamic was Evelyn's impending 33rd birthday. It was a date circled in invisible red ink by every member of the Harper household. Years ago, Evelyn's grandfather, the true patriarch who had seen through his son Arthur's greed, had established a massive, untouchable trust fund for Evelyn. He knew her gentle nature would be crushed by her family. The stipulation was ironclad. The millions of dollars, along with controlling shares of the family's real estate holdings, would transfer solely to Evelyn on her 33rd birthday. It was a ticking time bomb of wealth and power that Arthur, Eleanor, and Margaret could not abide losing. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon in late October when the carefully constructed illusion of Evelyn's life began to unravel. David had returned early from what he claimed was a stressful 3-day business trip to Chicago. He had walked into the house, kissed her forehead with a distracted air, and immediately headed for the shower, leaving his heavy, bespoke wool suit jacket draped carelessly over the back of a velvet armchair in their bedroom. Evelyn, acting on the quiet devotion of a loving wife, picked up the jacket to take it to her sewing room. It was a beautiful piece, one she had tailored for him herself the previous year. She knew every stitch, every contour of the midnight blue fabric. As she carried it down the hallway, the heavy wool resting over her forearm, her sensitive fingertips brushed against the interior breast pocket. She paused. A master seamstress knows the weight and drape of a garment intimately. Something was wrong. The left side of the jacket, specifically the lining beneath the inner pocket, felt unnaturally stiff. It didn't bend with the fluid grace of the silk lining she had so carefully sewn. It felt thick, almost like cardboard was wedged between the layers of fabric. Curiosity, a trait she had long been taught to suppress, sparked to life in her chest. She carried the jacket into her sunlit sanctuary, shutting the heavy oak door behind her. She laid the jacket flat on her large cutting table, turning on the high-intensity task lamp. Running her hands over the silk lining, she traced the stiff anomaly. It was a rectangular shape, completely concealed within the lining itself, stitched shut with a thread that was just a half shade darker than the midnight blue she had originally used. To anyone else, it was invisible. To Evelyn, it was a glaring, screaming violation of her work. Someone had unpicked her seams and re-sewn them to hide something inside the jacket. Her heart began a slow, rhythmic pounding against her ribs. Why would David alter the jacket she made him? Why hide something inside the lining rather than just keeping it in a briefcase or a locked drawer? She opened her mahogany drawer and pulled out her seam ripper, a small, sharp tool with a red plastic handle and a curved, lethal blade. Her hands, usually so steady, betrayed a slight tremor as she brought the blade to the dark thread. Snip! The tiny sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. She severed another thread, then another, expertly opening a 3-inch gap in the silk lining without damaging the surrounding fabric. She slipped her 2 index fingers into the dark, hidden pocket and felt the smooth surface of thick paper. Slowly, she pulled the hidden object out into the light. It was a tightly folded manila envelope. No name, no address. The seal had been broken. Evelyn stared at it for a long minute. A sickening wave of dread washed over her, chilling her blood. Part of her, the part that Eleanor and Margaret had meticulously programmed over 32 years, screamed at her to put it back. "You're being paranoid, Evelyn. You're having an episode. David loves you. Don't ruin everything with your crazy suspicions." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the instilled anxiety. Then she opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents, heavily stamped and notarized. The first page bore the letterhead of the St. Jude Psychiatric Institute, an exclusive, highly restrictive mental health facility located in a remote part of upstate New York. Evelyn's breath hitched. She forced her eyes to scan the heavy black text. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. The patient name listed at the top in bold, sterile letters was Evelyn Grace Harper Vance. She felt the floor tilt beneath her. She leaned heavily against the cutting table, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges of the papers. She read the diagnosis section. Patient exhibits severe, progressive paranoid schizophrenia, complicated by acute delusional episodes and violent ideations. Patient represents a significant and immediate danger to herself and those around her. Institutionalization in a secure, long-term care facility is deemed medically necessary and urgent. "No," Evelyn whispered to the empty room. "No, this isn't real." She had never been to St. Jude. She had never spoken to the doctor whose signature sat at the bottom of the page. A doctor, Elias Thorne. It was a complete fabrication, a terrifying clinical lie. Her trembling hands moved to the second document. It was an involuntary commitment order. It outlined that due to her escalating instability, she was to be forcibly transferred to the facility. The date set for the transfer was exactly 2 weeks away, 3 days before her 33rd birthday. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The trust fund. If she were declared legally incompetent and committed to an institution, she could not claim her grandfather's inheritance. But who would control it? She flipped frantically to the third document, a durable power of attorney for healthcare and finances. This document surrendered every right Evelyn had. Her medical choices, her bank accounts, her assets, her very freedom, to her legal guardians. She looked at the bottom of the page where the signatures were required. There, in stark, undeniable black ink, were the signatures that shattered the foundation of her entire existence. The first signature belonged to David Vance, her loving, devoted husband, the man who held her when she cried. Directly beneath his name were the co-signatures of her conservators, the people endorsing this horrifying lie. Arthur Harper, Eleanor Harper, Margaret Harper. Evelyn dropped the papers as if they had caught fire. They scattered across the polished wood of her cutting table, stark white against the dark mahogany. She backed away, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream that tore up her throat. Her chest heaved as she fought for oxygen. The room spun, the bolts of fabric blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors. It wasn't just David. It wasn't just a cheating husband hiding a mistress or a gambling debt. It was an execution order. Her entire family, the people whose blood ran in her veins, the man who slept beside her every night, had conspired to bury her alive in a psychiatric ward to steal her inheritance. Every memory of the last 10 years flashed behind her eyes, recontextualized in a horrifying new light. Margaret's constant gaslighting. "You're imagining things, Evelyn. You always do this." Eleanor's faux concern. "We just want you to get better, darling. You're so fragile." Arthur's cold dismissals. "She's unfit for the public eye. Keep her at home." And David handing her those little white pills every night, ensuring she stayed docile, sleepy, and compliant. They hadn't just been breaking her down, they had been building a paper trail. Every staged panic attack, every manipulated argument, was a brick in the asylum they were building for her. They had engineered her madness so perfectly that when the men in the white coats came for her in 2 weeks, not a single person in their elite social circle would question it. They would simply pity the poor Harper family for having such a tragic, broken daughter. A profound, terrifying silence settled over Evelyn. The panic attack that her mother would have expected, the hysterical sobbing that her sister would have mocked, did not come. Instead, an icy, crystalline clarity washed over her brain. For 32 years, they had told her she was crazy. They had told her she was weak. Standing in the sunlight of her sewing room, staring at the paperwork that detailed her demise, Evelyn realized the greatest truth of her life. She was the only sane person in a family of monsters. She walked slowly back to the cutting table. Her hands were no longer shaking. She picked up the psychiatric evaluation, the commitment order, the power of attorney. She folded them meticulously, exactly along the creases David had made. She slipped them back into the manila envelope. She slid the envelope back into the hidden pocket of the jacket. She threaded a needle with the exact shade of dark thread, and with swift, expert, invisible stitches, she closed the lining. When she smoothed her hand over the fabric, it was perfect. No one would ever know it had been opened. Evelyn Harper had died in this room today. The fragile, submissive daughter was gone, murdered by the signatures of her own flesh and blood. In her place, a new woman was born. A woman who possessed millions of dollars, a genius-level intellect for detail, and a burning glacial rage that demanded absolute destruction. She picked up the jacket, draped it over her arm, and walked out of the sewing room to serve her husband dinner. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in domestic theater, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn Harper was not merely an unwitting prop on the stage. She was the director secretly rewriting the script. She served roasted duck with cherry reduction, setting the fine bone china plates onto the mahogany table with hands that were remarkably steady. David sat at the head of the table, the picture of the exhausted but devoted executive. He wore the very jacket she had surgically invaded hours earlier, oblivious to the fact that the lining now harbored not only his treason, but her awakening. "How was your day, darling?" David asked, his tone dripping with that rehearsed, syrupy concern he always used. He reached across the table, his manicured hand covering hers. His skin felt warm, yet to Evelyn it was like being touched by a corpse. "Quiet," Evelyn replied, forcing a soft, vacuous smile to her lips. She pitched her voice to that breathy, fragile register they all expected from her. "I spent most of the afternoon in the sewing room. My head felt a bit cloudy." It was the magic word. David's eyes, a pale, calculating blue, flickered with dark satisfaction. "You've been pushing yourself too hard, Evie. Your mother called earlier. She's worried about your nerves. We all just want you to rest." He withdrew his hand and reached into his vest pocket, retrieving the small silver pillbox he carried everywhere. With the practiced ease of a magician performing his favorite trick, he popped the clasp and extracted a small, chalky white pill. It was a heavy sedative, one that left a metallic taste on her tongue and cast a thick, suffocating fog over her mind for the next 12 hours. For years, she had swallowed them obediently, believing they were keeping the monsters in her head at bay. Now she knew the monsters were the ones handing her the water glass. "Here, sweetheart," David coaxed, holding the pill out to her. "Take this now so it can get into your system before bed." Evelyn took the pill. She placed it on her tongue, taking a long sip from her crystal water goblet. But as the glass obscured her mouth, she didn't swallow. She skillfully pushed the pill deep into the pocket of her cheek, right against her lower gum. She swallowed the water audibly, smiled sleepily at her husband, and gently dabbed her mouth with her linen napkin. When she lowered the napkin, the pill was safely wrapped inside its folds. "Thank you, David," she murmured. "You always take such good care of me." Over the next 5 days, Evelyn maintained this dangerous charade. Every morning and every night, she palmed the sedatives, flushing them down the toilet when the shower was running. The physical withdrawal was a silent agony. She suffered through debilitating headaches, night sweats, and tremors that she hid by burying herself under her heavy-down comforter. But as the chemicals finally leached from her bloodstream, something miraculous happened. The heavy, suffocating veil that had draped over her consciousness for nearly a decade began to lift. Her mind, once sluggish and prone to suggestion, snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. Colors seemed brighter. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. She remembered conversations with perfect clarity. The gaslighting tactics her mother and Margaret used, moving her reading glasses, denying things they had said only hours before, became laughably transparent. She saw the strings attached to her limbs, and more importantly, she saw the hands pulling them. With her newfound lucidity came an icy, methodical patience. She had exactly 9 days before the transfer to the St. Jude Psychiatric Institute. 9 days to dismantle a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Her first task was to understand the full scope of David's betrayal. A man who signed away his wife's freedom for a share of her inheritance was undoubtedly securing his own private future on the side. The Harpers were too arrogant to think she would ever check the bank statements or the credit card bills, but Evelyn didn't need a paper trail. She had a seamstress's eye for detail. She noticed the subtle changes in David. The faint floral scent lingering on his collar that was decidedly cheaper than his usual cologne. The way he meticulously polished his shoes on Tuesday evenings. The fact that the mileage on his black Mercedes did not match his supposed commute to the financial district. On a crisp Thursday morning, Evelyn enacted her first offensive maneuver. She announced at the breakfast table that she was beginning a complex, heavily beaded bridal gown for a private client. "It requires absolute concentration," she told Eleanor over the phone, her voice intentionally tremulous. "I can't have any interruptions. I'll be practically living in the sewing room from dawn until dusk." Eleanor, thrilled that her daughter was isolating herself further, readily agreed, instructing the household staff not to disturb the poor, fragile dear. Instead of going to the sewing room, Evelyn slipped out the servants' entrance, dressed in an unassuming beige trench coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and dark sunglasses. She walked a mile to a commercial avenue and paid cash for a cheap prepaid mobile phone and a rental car, a nondescript gray sedan that blended perfectly into the city traffic. For 3 days, Evelyn became a shadow. She trailed David's Mercedes from the polished driveway of their estate to the grittier industrial outskirts of Boston. He didn't go to his gleaming glass office building. He drove to a modest brick apartment complex in South Boston, a neighborhood where the Harpers wouldn't be caught dead. Evelyn parked down the street, watching through the windshield as David punched a code into the lobby door and disappeared inside. He stayed for exactly 2 hours. When he emerged, he looked relaxed, unbuttoning his collar before driving away. Evelyn waited another hour before approaching the building. She scanned the directory panel. Apartment 4B. The name scrawled on the faded paper slot was Clara Hayes. A bitter smile touched Evelyn's lips. Of course, a mistress. It was the oldest cliché in the book. David was likely stashing his plaything here, waiting for the day his wealthy wife was locked away in a padded cell so he could live lavishly with his new woman. But Evelyn's meticulous mind wasn't satisfied with assumptions. She needed to know her enemy. She needed leverage. The next afternoon, knowing David was scheduled for a supposed board meeting with her father, Evelyn returned to the apartment building. Gaining entry was remarkably simple for someone who spent her life understanding how things were put together. A tenant leaving with a load of laundry held the lobby door open for her, assuming the well-dressed woman in the beige coat belonged there. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, her heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. She stood before the door of 4B. Using a set of professional lockpicks she had purchased from a specialized catalog years ago, ostensibly to repair antique jewelry boxes, she went to work. Her fingers, trained to guide threads through the eye of a needle, manipulated the pins within the cheap brass lock with ease. In less than a minute, the deadbolt clicked. Evelyn slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. She expected a sultry love nest. What she found stopped her dead in her tracks. The apartment was painfully small and sparsely furnished. The air smelled of cheap soup and stale anxiety. There were no expensive gifts from David, no fine jewelry or designer clothes. Instead, the small living room was dominated by a cheap wooden baby crib and stacks of generic brand diapers. Evelyn walked slowly toward the bedroom, her eyes scanning the details. On the cheap laminate dresser sat a bottle of prenatal vitamins and an ultrasound photograph. Clara is pregnant. The realization was a sharp sting, but it didn't explain the poverty of the apartment. If David was about to inherit millions through Evelyn's institutionalization, why was his pregnant mistress living in near squalor? It didn't fit the profile of a gold digger. Suddenly, the heavy clunk of the deadbolt echoing through the small apartment shattered the silence. Someone was unlocking the front door. Evelyn didn't panic. She moved with the silent grace of a ghost, slipping into the bedroom closet and pulling the louvered doors shut just enough to leave a narrow slit for her to see through. She pressed herself against the wall, hiding behind a row of cheap maternity dresses. Footsteps entered the living room. 2 sets. One was a heavy, exhausted shuffle. The other was the sharp, unmistakable click of expensive stilettos on linoleum. "Sit down, Clara. You look dreadful. I won't have you stressing the child." The voice sent a jolt of pure ice down Evelyn's spine. It wasn't David. It was Margaret, her sister. Evelyn pressed her eye to the slit in the closet door. In the living room, a young woman, no older than 22, with dark circles under her eyes and a belly heavy with late-stage pregnancy, collapsed onto the worn sofa. Clara Hayes looked terrified, her hands trembling as she clutched a threadbare cardigan around her shoulders. Standing over her, wrapped in a pristine white cashmere coat that cost more than a year's rent for this apartment, was Margaret Harper. She looked at Clara not with the fury of a betrayed sister-in-law, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a horse breeder inspecting a mare. "I took my vitamins, Ms. Harper," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Just like you told me." "You better have," Margaret snapped, removing her leather gloves finger by finger. "Dr. Evans says the baby's weight is slightly below average. You are a vessel, Clara. A poorly maintained one at the moment, but a vessel nonetheless. I am paying an exorbitant amount of money to clear your father's gambling debts and keep those loan sharks from breaking his legs. The absolute least you can do is incubate my child properly." In the closet, Evelyn stopped breathing. The darkness around her seemed to spin. "My child." Margaret paced the small room, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to an execution. "David tells me you've been crying when he visits. This pathetic emotional display stops now. You knew the arrangement when we selected you. David provides the genetic material to ensure the child looks like a Harper, and you provide the womb. The paperwork is already drawn up. The moment you give birth, you will sign the surrender documents. The child will be registered as mine and David's, a miraculous private adoption to heal our family's tragedy after Evelyn is put away." Clara let out a choked sob, wrapping her arms protectively around her swollen belly. But what about after? You promised I could leave the state. You promised the debt would be gone." Margaret stopped pacing. She looked down at the weeping girl, her beautiful face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. "Oh, Clara," Margaret sighed, a sound of mock pity. "You really are a sweet, stupid girl. Do you honestly think the Harper family leaves loose ends? A hysterical birth mother wandering around with the truth? That's far too messy." Clara looked up, her eyes widening in horror as the implication washed over her. "No. I said what I needed to say to get you into that bed with David," Margaret stated coldly. "Once the baby is safely in my arms and my idiot sister is locked in St. Jude's drooling on herself, we will be the perfect, tragic family overcoming adversity. As for you, well, the mortality rate for young, Destitute mothers in this part of town is tragically high. A postpartum overdose, perhaps. It will be very sad, but quickly forgotten. Margaret checked her diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. David will be here in an hour with your groceries. Pull yourself together. I despise looking at your tears. Without another word, Margaret turned and walked out of the apartment. The door slammed shut, the sound vibrating through the thin walls. Clara Hayes fell apart. She slid off the sofa onto the cheap rug, curling into a ball around her unborn child, sobbing with the raw, guttural sound of an animal caught in a steel trap. She was utterly alone, trapped by debt, carrying a child she was doomed to lose, and marked for death by one of the most powerful families in the state. Inside the closet, the last remnants of the fragile, submissive Evelyn Harper burned away to ash. What remained was forged in steel and absolute clarity. The hinges groaned slightly in the quiet room. Clara gasped, scrambling backward against the sofa, her tear-streaked face pale with terror. She grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the coffee table, holding it up with shaking hands. "Who are you? How did you get in here? I'll scream." Evelyn stepped out of the shadows of the bedroom hallway. She removed her wide-brimmed hat and the dark sunglasses, letting them fall to the floor. The afternoon light caught her features, the elegant cheekbones, the dark hair, the unmistakable resemblance to the woman who had just left. Clara's eyes widened in recognition, dropping the ashtray. You're his wife. You're Evelyn." Evelyn didn't look at Clara with hatred. She looked at her with a profound, terrifying empathy. She walked slowly toward the terrified pregnant woman and knelt on the worn rug directly in front of her. "They told me you were a gold digger," Evelyn said softly, her voice no longer breathy or fragile, but possessing a deep, resonant authority. "They told you I was a lunatic who needed to be locked away. It seems we are both starring in a script written by my sister." Clara was hyperventilating, pressing herself into the fabric of the sofa. "She's going to kill me. She's going to take my baby and kill me. And David knows. David is a coward who follows the money," Evelyn stated, her eyes locking onto Clara's terrified gaze. She reached out, her steady, capable tailor's hands gently grasping Clara's trembling ones. The physical contact made the younger woman flinch, but Evelyn held firm. "Clara, listen to me very carefully," Evelyn commanded, her tone slicing through the girl's panic like a scalpel. "In 9 days, Margaret intends to put me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. A week after that, you are scheduled to give birth, and Margaret intends to put you in the ground." Tears streamed freely down Clara's face, a silent confirmation of her doomed fate. "We are ghosts to them," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous, conspiratorial whisper. "We are problems waiting to be erased, but they are arrogant, Clara. They think because they have the money and the power they have already won. They think we are weak." Evelyn squeezed Clara's hands, transferring a surge of her own newly ignited strength. "I am not going to a hospital, and you are not going to die. But if we are going to survive this, if you are going to keep your child, you have to trust me. We have to do exactly what they least expect." Clara looked at the elegant, formidable woman kneeling before her. This was not the heavily medicated, unstable wife David had described. This was a predator who had just discovered she was being hunted and had decided to turn the tables. What do you want me to do?" Clara whispered, a tiny spark of desperate hope igniting in her eyes. Evelyn's lips curved into a cold, devastating smile. "We are going to let them think everything is going exactly according to their plan. We are going to smile, and we are going to nod, and while they are looking the other way, celebrating their brilliance." Evelyn stood up, her silhouette commanding the small, pathetic room. "We are going to burn the Harper family to the ground." The alliance forged in that bleak South Boston apartment was not sealed with blood, but with an ironclad vow of silence. Evelyn left Clara with a burner phone, a stack of cash withdrawn over months of careful grocery skimming, and strict instructions. Do not change your routine. Cry when David visits. Beg Margaret for mercy. Be exactly the pathetic victim they need you to be. When Evelyn returned to the sprawling Harper estate that evening, the heavy iron gates closing behind her felt less like a prison door locking and more like a trap snapping shut around her prey. She slipped back into her role flawlessly. She was the drooping flower, the fragile wife whose hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass at the dinner table. It was Sunday evening, the night of the traditional Harper family dinner. The dining room was a cavern of dark mahogany and crystal chandeliers, a stage designed to make anyone sitting at the table feel exceedingly small. Arthur sat at the head, cutting into his prime rib with the precision of a surgeon. Eleanor was positioned to his right, her neck dripping in pearls, dissecting the latest country club gossip. Margaret sat across from Evelyn, radiating a smug, predatory energy that made Evelyn's stomach turn. "Evelyn, darling," Eleanor crooned, pausing with her silver fork halfway to her mouth. "You look terribly pale tonight. Are those dark circles under your eyes? David, is she taking her medication?" David, ever the dutiful actor, reached over and patted Evelyn's hand. "She is, Eleanor. The new dosage Dr. Thorne prescribed just makes her a bit lethargic. It's an adjustment period." "Well, it's for the best," Margaret chimed in, taking a delicate sip of her Cabernet. She looked directly at Evelyn, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. "We just want you safe, Evie. The world is a very complicated place for someone with your sensitivities. Sometimes a quiet, structured environment is the only cure." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. St. Jude's. They were already celebrating her incarceration. Evelyn looked down at her plate, letting her hair fall forward to hide the absolute coldness in her eyes. "You're right, Margaret," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the table. "I do feel quite exhausted. The lights in here are giving me a terrible migraine. If you'll all excuse me, I think I need to lie down." Arthur didn't even look up from his meat. "Go rest, Evelyn. We have business to discuss anyway." David half rose from his chair. "Do you want me to come up with you, sweetheart?" "No," Evelyn said quickly, perhaps a breath too quickly. She forced a tired, grateful smile. "No, stay and finish your wine with my father. I just need darkness." She glided out of the dining room, her footsteps silent on the thick carpets. She climbed the grand sweeping staircase, her posture slumped, playing the part for any of the household staff who might be watching. But the moment she reached the shadows of the second-floor landing, her spine snapped straight. The lethargy vanished, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline-fueled purpose. She did not go to her bedroom. She moved silently down the long, portrait-lined corridor toward the east wing. Arthur Harper's study was a fortress. It was located at the farthest end of the estate, a room paneled in rich cherry wood and smelling permanently of expensive Scotch and Cuban cigars. The door was solid oak, fitted with a heavy brass lock that Arthur insisted only he had the key for. But Evelyn was a woman who spent her life observing the minuscule details others ignored. She knew that her father, a creature of rigid habit, kept a spare key hidden inside the hollowed-out base of the antique bronze greyhound statue on the hallway console table. He thought it was terribly clever. To Evelyn, it was just another seam she knew how to unpick. She retrieved the key, her gloved hand leaving no prints on the bronze. She slid it into the lock. The tumblers clicked with a heavy, satisfying thud. She slipped inside and gently pushed the door shut, locking it from the inside. The study was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the tall French doors that led out to a stone balcony. Evelyn didn't dare turn on the lamps. She moved quickly to the massive desk that dominated the center of the room. Behind it hung a large, imposing oil painting of Evelyn's grandfather, the man whose trust fund was the catalyst for this entire nightmare. Evelyn knew what was behind that painting. She had seen it years ago, during one of those rare moments when her father had forgotten to close the door fully while he worked. It was a state-of-the-art wall safe, flush against the masonry. She swung the painting outward on its hidden hinges. The digital keypad of the safe glowed with a faint, greenish light. Arthur Harper was an arrogant man, a man who believed himself smarter than everyone else in the room. Men like that rarely used random, secure combinations. They used numbers that stroked their egos. Evelyn closed her eyes, remembering a conversation she had overheard a decade ago when Arthur had triumphantly acquired his rival's real estate firm in a hostile takeover. August 14th, 1998. "The day I became a king," he had boasted. Evelyn's fingers flew over the keypad. "Oh, 81498. A soft beep. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside were stacks of velvet jewelry boxes and bearer bonds, but Evelyn ignored them. Her prize lay at the very bottom, 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers. The black books. the true accounting of the Harper Empire. She pulled them out, carrying them to the desk. From the deep pockets of her cardigan, she withdrew her tools. Not a camera, the flash would be too bright, and the click of the shutter too loud in the silent house. Instead, she pulled out a roll of professional tailor's tracing paper and a block of specialized tailor's wax. In the high-end fashion world, when a designer needed to perfectly replicate a complex, intricate lace pattern without damaging the original fabric, they used tracing paper and wax to create a highly detailed friction copy. It was an old-world technique, silent, fast, and incredibly accurate. Evelyn opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with Arthur's cramped, precise handwriting. It was a masterpiece of financial crime. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, dummy corporations set up to dodge federal taxes, massive bribes paid to city zoning commissioners to secure real estate monopolies. It was enough to put Arthur and David in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. She laid the translucent tracing paper over the open ledger. With rapid, sweeping motions, she rubbed the wax block over the paper. The raised ink and heavy indentations of Arthur's pen on the thick accounting paper transferred instantly onto the tracing sheet, creating a perfect, undeniable copy. Flip, rub, fold. Her hands moved with the blinding speed and precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime making perfect garments under impossible deadlines. Flip, rub, fold. She copied the shell company names. She copied the account routing numbers. She copied the dates and amounts of the bribes. She was halfway through the second ledger when the terrifying sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Evelyn froze, the wax block hovering inches from the paper. The footsteps were approaching the east wing. It wasn't the soft, measured tread of a maid. It was the sharp, confident click of Margaret's heels, accompanied by the low rumble of Arthur's voice. "Needs to be finalized tonight, Margaret. Once she's committed on the 14th, the board will want assurances." They were coming to the study. Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs with the force of a trapped bird. She looked at the heavy oak door. The brass handle was already beginning to turn. She had locked it from the inside, but she knew Arthur had the master key on his ring. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. But the fragile Evelyn was dead. The woman standing in the dark study was fighting for her life. She shoved the ledgers back into the safe, slamming the heavy steel door shut and spinning the dial. She swung her grandfather's portrait back into place. She snatched up the waxy, crinkling sheets of tracing paper, rolling them tightly and shoving them deep into the waistband of her skirt. The lock on the study door clicked. A key was sliding in. There was no time to hide under the desk, no time to slip behind the heavy velvet drapes. Evelyn lunged for the French doors at the back of the room. She turned the latch, slipping out onto the stone balcony just as the main study door swung open, throwing a rectangle of harsh yellow light across the room. Evelyn pulled the French doors shut, pressing herself flat against the exterior brick wall. Outside, a sudden, vicious autumn storm had rolled in off the Atlantic. Freezing rain lashed against her, instantly soaking through her thin cardigan and silk blouse. The wind howled, a deafening roar that masked the sound of her frantic, ragged breathing. Through the rain-streaked glass of the French doors, she could see them. Arthur walked to his desk, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her eyes narrowed. Evelyn watched in horror as Margaret slowly turned her head, looking directly toward the balcony doors. Margaret walked over to the glass. Evelyn pressed her back harder against the rough, freezing brick, inching toward the stone balustrade. The balcony was narrow, barely 3 feet wide. Below her was a terrifying 3-story drop to the flagstone patio. Margaret put her hand on the brass latch of the French doors. She peered out into the darkness. "Did you leave these unlatched, Father?" Margaret's muffled voice bled through the glass. "It's freezing in here." "The maid must have opened them while dusting," Arthur dismissed gruffly from his desk. "Lock them, Margaret, and come look at this prospectus." Margaret hesitated. Her dark eyes scanned the shadows of the balcony. Evelyn was mere inches away, hidden only by the sharp angle of the brick wall. The freezing rain plastered Evelyn's hair to her face, water running into her eyes, stinging her vision. She didn't dare blink. She didn't dare breathe. If Margaret opened that door, it was over. The asylum, Clara's death, all of it. For 3 agonizing seconds, the 2 sisters were separated by nothing but a pane of glass and a few inches of darkness. It was a silent, invisible standoff. Finally, Margaret turned the brass latch with a sharp click, locking the French doors from the inside. She pulled the heavy velvet drapes shut, plunging the balcony into absolute, terrifying darkness. Evelyn let out a silent, shaking gasp, her legs giving way. She sank to the wet stone floor of the balcony, the freezing rain beating down on her. Her teeth chattered violently, her entire body convulsing from the sudden drop in temperature and the massive crash of adrenaline. She reached a trembling hand into her waistband. The roll of tracing paper was there, dry and secure against her skin. She sat in the freezing storm for 45 minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of her father and sister planning her demise on the other side of the glass. She embraced the cold, let it seep into her bones. Every shiver, every drop of icy rain was a reminder of what they were capable of. When the lights in the study finally went out and the door clicked shut, Evelyn stood up. She was soaked to the bone, shivering so hard she could barely stand. But inside, a furnace of pure, righteous fury was burning hotter than ever. She used her lockpicks on the French doors, her numb fingers fumbling, dropping the metal tension wrench twice before finally hearing the satisfying click. She slipped back into the dry warmth of the study, leaving no trace of water on the rug, and made her way back through the silent, sleeping house to her bedroom. David was asleep, snoring softly, a silk eye mask covering his face. He hadn't even noticed she was gone. Evelyn locked herself in her ensuite bathroom. She stripped off her soaked clothes, hiding them at the bottom of her laundry hamper. She turned on the shower, letting the hot water run, and carefully unrolled the tracing paper on the dry marble vanity. The perfect, damning copies of the Harper family's sins stared back at her. She had the weapon. Now, she just needed the perfect battlefield. Climax 1 complete. The pieces are on the board. The next morning, the Harper household returned to its polished, deceitful normalcy. Evelyn, nursing a genuine head cold from her time on the balcony, played her role to the hilt. She stayed in bed, sipping hot tea brought up by the maids, coughing weakly whenever Eleanor peeked her head in. "Just resting up for the charity gala, darling?" Eleanor asked, her eyes devoid of actual warmth. The Autumn Equinox Gala. It was the premier event of the Boston social season, hosted by the Harpers themselves at the Grand Symphony Hall. It was scheduled for Saturday night, exactly 5 days before Evelyn's supposed transfer to St. Jude's. The guest list included the governor, federal judges, and half of the city's financial elite. It was Margaret and Eleanor's crowning glory of the year. "Yes, Mother," Evelyn whispered, coughing delicately into a lace handkerchief. "I want to be strong enough to attend. It means so much to Margaret." "Well, don't push yourself," Eleanor said dismissively. "Margaret will shine regardless. She always does." When the door closed, Evelyn threw off the covers. Her eyes were bright, feverish, not with illness, but with anticipation. The gala was the perfect battlefield. It was highly public, heavily guarded, and packed with the very authorities Arthur Harper spent his life bribing and avoiding. If she handed the evidence to a local precinct, Arthur's lawyers would bury it before the ink was dry. She needed an explosive, undeniable spectacle. She needed to drop the evidence directly into the lap of the federal authorities in front of 500 witnesses, making a cover-up impossible. But there was a massive logistical problem. The Harpers, anticipating Evelyn might act out as her commitment date neared, had tightened their security. David shadowed her every move outside the house. The household staff reported her phone calls. Her purse was discreetly checked by Eleanor under the guise of looking for misplaced medication. She couldn't walk into the heavily secured Symphony Hall carrying a manila folder full of stolen financial records. They would intercept her, claim she was having a paranoid delusion, sedate her, and whisk her away to the asylum that very night. She needed a way to smuggle the evidence right past their noses. She needed a Trojan horse. That afternoon, Evelyn walked down to the grand sitting room where Margaret was barking orders at a team of florists. "Margaret," Evelyn said softly, standing in the doorway. Margaret sighed, an exaggerated sound of annoyance. "What is it, Evelyn? I'm extremely busy. The governor's office just confirmed his attendance, and the centerpieces are a disaster. I know you've been stressed about finding the right gown," Evelyn said, keeping her head slightly bowed, playing the eager-to-please, subservient sister. "That designer from New York let you down. I was thinking, since I'm feeling a bit better, I could make your dress for the gala." Margaret stopped mid-sentence, turning to look at her sister. Disdain warred with vanity in her eyes. It was a well-known fact in their circle that Evelyn, despite her mental frailty, was an absolute savant with fabric. Her designs were masterpieces that rivaled Paris haute couture. Margaret had always secretly envied her sister's talent. "You want to make my dress?" Margaret asked, her tone suspicious. "In 5 days?" "I have the red silk organza you ordered from Milan last month," Evelyn offered meekly. "The one you said was too beautiful to trust to a local tailor. I want to do this for you, Margaret, as a thank you for looking out for me." The flattery was a precise, calculated strike at Margaret's massive ego. The idea of wearing a custom, breathtaking gown and simultaneously exploiting her sister's free labor while preparing to lock her in an asylum was too delicious for Margaret to pass up. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across Margaret's face. "Very well, Evelyn, but it must be perfect. I want dramatic draping. I want a sweeping train. I want all eyes on me." "They will be," Evelyn promised, her voice a soft, deadly whisper that Margaret entirely misinterpreted. "I promise you, Margaret. Everyone in that room will be looking at you." Evelyn retreated to her sewing room, locking the heavy oak door. She did not reach for the red silk immediately. Instead, she pulled down her heavy vintage camera, a 35mm Leica she used to document her completed gowns. She set up a makeshift macro photography stand using her cutting table lamps. Working with meticulous precision, she photographed every single page of the tracing paper copies she had taken from Arthur's safe. Once the film was exposed, she used the darkroom chemicals she kept locked in a cabinet to develop the negatives. But she didn't print them into standard photographs. She used a specialized chemical reduction process, shrinking the images down until they were tiny, high-resolution microphotographs. It was a technique she had read about in an old espionage book David had left lying around years ago. When she was finished, she had dozens of tiny, durable squares of film. To the naked eye, they looked like tiny scraps of black plastic. Under a magnifying glass, they were the indictments that would destroy the Harper Empire. Then she took out the bolt of blood-red silk organza. For 4 days and 4 nights, Evelyn barely slept. She functioned on pure adrenaline and the cold metallic taste of impending vengeance. She crafted a masterpiece. The gown was a stunning structural marvel. It featured a corseted bodice that demanded perfect posture, a dramatic sweeping overskirt, and a complex multi-layered crinoline underskirt that gave the dress immense volume and movement. It was within the architecture of that underskirt that Evelyn executed her true genius. Using her finest, sharpest needle, Evelyn sewed the tiny squares of microfilm directly into the elaborate, ruffled seams of the crinoline layers. She didn't just hide them. She integrated them into the very structure of the garment. She used a fragile, basting stitch, a temporary stitch designed to be easily ripped away, to hold the crucial seams together. She was sewing Arthur's offshore accounts into the hem. She was stitching Margaret's bribery records into the waistline. Every fold of the luxurious red silk hid a fatal secret. On the afternoon of the gala, Evelyn brought the finished gown to Margaret's suite. Margaret stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her breath catching as she slipped into the dress. It was magnificent. The red silk cascaded around her like liquid fire. It made her look powerful, regal, and untouchable. "It's acceptable," Margaret lied, unable to hide the gleam of pure vanity in her eyes. She turned sharply, making the heavy skirts flare out. "The weight of the skirt is a bit unusual, though." "It's the structural crinoline, Margaret," Evelyn explained, her face a mask of placid submission. She knelt behind her sister, adjusting the long, sweeping train. Her fingers brushed against the hidden seams holding the microfilm. "It's designed to give you that dramatic silhouette when you walk. It ensures you take up space, that no one can ignore you." Margaret laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Well, they certainly won't ignore me tonight." She looked down at Evelyn, a flicker of genuine, chilling pity crossing her face. "You did a good job, Evie. It's a shame you won't be able to utilize this talent where you're going." Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from the blood-red silk. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Margaret," Evelyn said quietly. "Have a wonderful evening." That night, Symphony Hall was ablaze with light and dripping in opulence. The Boston elite mingled under crystal chandeliers, drinking vintage champagne and exchanging hollow pleasantries. Evelyn arrived on David's arm, wearing a simple, understated black velvet dress. She was the shadow to Margaret's blinding flame. Margaret was the undisputed queen of the room, gliding through the crowd in the red silk gown, completely oblivious to the fact that she was wearing a Trojan horse loaded with her family's destruction. Evelyn scanned the room. She spotted the governor laughing with her father. She saw the chief of police smoking a cigar on the terrace. And then, standing near the grand staircase, she saw the man she had been researching for the past 3 days, Special Agent Thomas Vance, a senior FBI investigator known for his incorruptibility and his long-standing, frustrated pursuit of the Harper family's financial dealings. The clock was ticking. At 10 p.m., the orchestra began to play a sweeping waltz. Arthur Harper took to the grand mahogany podium at the front of the hall to deliver his annual charity address. The crowd quieted, turning their attention to the patriarch. David leaned in close to Evelyn, his grip on her arm suddenly tightening, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Your mother thinks you're looking a bit erratic, Evelyn," he whispered harshly in her ear. "Smile, or we skip the cake and take you straight to St. Jude's tonight." Evelyn looked at her husband. She didn't shrink away. She didn't lower her eyes. For the first time in 5 years, she looked at him with the cold, dead gaze of a predator who has cornered its prey. "You can let go of my arm now, David," she said, her voice carrying a chilling, absolute authority. David blinked, startled by the sudden shift in her demeanor. His grip loosened just enough. Evelyn stepped away from him. She didn't run. She walked with slow, deliberate, regal steps directly toward the center of the ballroom floor, right into the empty space in front of the podium where her father was speaking. The crowd parted around her, murmurs rippling through the elite guests as they recognized the fragile Harper daughter breaking protocol. Arthur stopped speaking mid-sentence, his face turning an angry, mottled red. "Evelyn," he hissed into the microphone. "Sit down, now." Eleanor rushed forward from the front table, her hands fluttering. "Oh, dear God, she's having an episode. David, get her. Someone call the paramedics." Margaret, furious that her moment in the spotlight was being ruined, stalked out onto the floor, the red silk gown billowing dramatically around her. "Evelyn, stop making a scene. You are embarrassing us." Margaret grabbed Evelyn's shoulder roughly, intending to drag her away. It was the exact moment Evelyn had engineered. Evelyn didn't fight back. Instead, she reached into the small black clutch purse she carried. She didn't pull out a tissue or a pillbox. She pulled out her seam ripper, the small, sharp tool with the curved, lethal blade. Before anyone could react, before the security guards could take a step, Evelyn grabbed the heavy, ruffled waistline of Margaret's red silk gown. With a single, vicious, upward slash, she drove the seam ripper into the fragile basting stitches she had spent days creating. "Rip!" The sound of tearing silk echoed like a gunshot through the silent, horrified ballroom. Margaret screamed, stumbling backward, clutching at her ruined dress. The structural integrity of the heavy crinoline collapsed entirely. The seams burst open, and from the intricate folds of the blood-red silk, a rain of tiny dark squares cascaded down, scattering across the polished parquet floor like black confetti. The ballroom descended into absolute, stunned silence. Evelyn stood in the center of the debris, holding the seam ripper, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with an unholy light. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger down at the tiny squares of microfilm covering the floor around Margaret's feet. She didn't look at her family. She looked directly across the room, locking eyes with FBI Special Agent Thomas Vance. Her voice, no longer a breathy whisper, rang out clear and resonant, slicing through the opulence of the gala. "Agent Vance," Evelyn projected, her voice commanding the room. "You'll want to collect those. They are the micro-photographed copies of Arthur Harper's offshore ledgers, the bribery logs for the City Zoning Commission, and the forged psychiatric evaluations designed to steal my inheritance." Chaos erupted. Arthur Harper dropped his microphone, his face draining of all color. He lunged off the stage, bellowing for his security guards. "She's insane! Don't listen to a word she says! Restrain her!" 2 large men in black suits charged toward Evelyn, but before they could reach her, Special Agent Vance, flanked by 3 off-duty federal officers who had been attending as guests, intercepted them, flashing their badges. "Nobody touches her!" Vance roared, instantly recognizing the magnitude of what was happening. He looked down at the microfilm scattered across the floor, then up at the terrified, crumbling facade of the Harper family. Margaret was on her knees, desperately trying to gather the tiny squares, sobbing hysterically as her ruined red dress pooled around her like spilled blood. Eleanor had fainted into David's arms. And David was backing away slowly, his eyes wide with the realization that the empire he had married into was currently burning to the ground, and he was standing in the center of the flames. Evelyn Harper stood completely still amid the screaming, the flashing lights, and the frantic scramble of federal agents securing the evidence. She looked at her father, watching the absolute arrogance shatter into pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at her husband, the coward, attempting to slip out a side door before an agent tackled him to the marble floor. She had done it. She had unpicked the seams of their perfect, gilded lie and laid the ugly, rotten truth bare for the entire world to see. The fragile, broken daughter was gone forever. In her place stood the seamstress, and she had just finished her masterpiece. The aftermath of the Autumn Equinox Gala was not a scandal. It was a total, catastrophic annihilation of the Harper legacy. When the sun rose over Boston the following morning, the gilded gates of the Harper estate were swarmed not by society reporters, but by federal vehicles. The microfilm, meticulously extracted from the ruined red silk of Margaret's gown, was undeniable. It was a perfect, damning roadmap of decades of financial corruption, racketeering, and conspiracy. The trial was the media spectacle of the decade, but Evelyn did not attend a single day of it. She didn't need to sit in a sterile courtroom to watch her family's desperate attempts to shift the blame onto one another. Margaret, stripped of her designer clothes and her haughty vanity, wept on the stand, claiming Arthur had forced her to forge the psychiatric documents. Arthur stoically blamed David, calling him a rogue opportunist. David, cowardly to the very end, tried to negotiate a plea deal by offering up Eleanor's secret offshore accounts. In the end, the judge showed no mercy to the architects of such profound cruelty. Arthur and David received 20 years each in federal prison. Margaret and Eleanor were sentenced to 15 years in a high-security women's correctional facility. The Harper Mansion, the sprawling real estate holdings, and the shell companies were seized and liquidated by the government. As for Evelyn, she spent the duration of the trial in a quiet, sunlit townhouse in Beacon Hill, a property purchased with the millions of dollars from her grandfather's trust fund, which had unlocked precisely on her 33rd birthday. She was not alone. On the night of the gala, while the FBI was handcuffing her family, Evelyn had quietly dispatched her newly hired private security team to the grimy apartment in South Boston. They arrived just hours before Arthur's remaining loyal fixers did. They packed Clara Hayes and her few belongings into an armored SUV and brought her directly to Evelyn's new sanctuary. 2 weeks later, in a private suite at Massachusetts General Hospital, Clara gave birth to a healthy, screaming baby boy. When the nurse asked for the father's name for the birth certificate, Clara looked over at Evelyn, who was standing by the window, watching the city lights. Evelyn walked over, her face softening with a warmth she had never been allowed to express in her old life. "Leave the father's name blank," Evelyn instructed the nurse gently. "His name is Leo Hayes." The next few months were a quiet period of healing and monumental rebuilding. Evelyn used a fraction of her vast inheritance to completely wipe out Clara's father's gambling debts, severing the young woman's ties to the criminal underworld forever. She didn't do it as an act of charity, but as an investment. She had seen the raw survival instinct in Clara's eyes, the fierce determination of a mother protecting her young. Evelyn recognized a kindred spirit, another woman who refused to be broken by the men who tried to own her. "You don't owe me anything, Clara," Evelyn told her one evening as they sat by the fireplace, baby Leo sleeping soundly in a bassinet between them. "You are free to take Leo and go anywhere in the world. I will ensure you are financially secure for the rest of your life." Clara, holding a cup of chamomile tea, looked around the elegant, peaceful living room, and then at the formidable woman who had saved her life. "I don't want to go anywhere else," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "I want to work. I want to learn. I want to build something so big that no one can ever look down on us again." Evelyn's lips curved into a slow, genuine smile. "Then we have a lot of work to do." 5 years later, Manhattan, New York. The crisp autumn wind whipped through the towering skyscrapers of Fifth Avenue. At the corner of 57th Street, a massive crowd of fashion journalists, elite buyers, and A-list celebrities was gathered outside a newly renovated 6-story flagship building. The brass letters above the sleek glass doors gleamed in the afternoon sun. Evelyn Grace. It was the most highly anticipated launch of the New York Fashion Week season. In just 5 years, the mysterious, brilliant designer who had emerged from the ashes of the Boston Harper scandal had built an absolute empire. The Evelyn Grace brand was not just clothing, it was armor. Her designs were famous for their impeccable architectural tailoring, utilizing luxurious fabrics to create silhouettes that commanded authority and respect. Her clientele consisted of female CEOs, senators, and women of power who refused to be underestimated. Inside the sprawling minimalist penthouse studio of the building, Evelyn stood before a massive mirror, adjusting the cuffs of her immaculate tailored white silk suit. At 38, she radiated a breathtaking glacial power. The hesitant, breathy voice was gone. The tremors in her hands were a distant memory. She moved with the decisive grace of a queen who had conquered her own kingdom. "The mayor is in the front row, and the buyer from Bergdorf wants an exclusive on the midnight blue velvet collection," a voice called out briskly. Evelyn turned. Clara Hayes walked into the studio holding a silver tablet, a Bluetooth earpiece tucked behind her ear. Clara was unrecognizable from the terrified pregnant girl in the South Boston apartment. She wore a razor-sharp charcoal pantsuit from the Evelyn Grace executive line, her hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. She was the chief operating officer of the company, a brilliant, ruthless negotiator who handled the business empire with the same fierce protectiveness she used for her son. "Tell Bergdorf they can have the exclusive for the East Coast, but only if they double their initial order on the daytime separates," Evelyn replied seamlessly, picking up a stray thread from her cutting table and tossing it away. "Already did," Clara smirked, tapping the tablet. "They agreed in 3 seconds. They're terrified of you." "They respect us," Evelyn corrected gently. "There's a difference." Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the studio swung open. A 5-year-old boy with a mop of dark curls and bright, intelligent eyes ran into the room, holding a brightly colored toy car. "Mommy! Auntie Evie!" little Leo shouted, his laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Clara immediately dropped into a crouch, catching her son as he barreled into her arms. Evelyn's imposing demeanor melted instantly. She knelt down next to them, her hand gently brushing Leo's curls. "Look at you, handsome," Evelyn said softly. "Are you ready to sit in the front row and watch our show?" "Yeah," Leo cheered, showing off his tiny, custom-tailored tuxedo. A production assistant poked her head through the doorway. "Miss Harper, Ms. Hayes, we are 2 minutes to runway." Evelyn stood up, offering a hand to Clara. Clara took it, pulling herself up. For a moment, the two women just looked at each other. They didn't need to speak about the past. They didn't need to mention the prison cells in Massachusetts, or the men who had tried to discard them. They had taken the worst betrayal imaginable and spun it into gold. They had taken the threads of deceit that were meant to bind them and used them to weave an impenetrable dynasty. "Shall we?" Clara asked, her eyes shining with fierce pride. "Let's show them what happens when you underestimate a seamstress," Evelyn replied. Together, the two women walked out of the studio and toward the blinding lights of the runway, the roar of the applause already beginning to shake the floorboards beneath their feet. They were not victims. They were not fragile. They were the architects of their own magnificent survival, and their reign had only just begun.